Humanity Matters.
Hello, and thank you for joining me today. I am your host, Rich Quinlan, on today's episode of That Really Happened here on HMTV. My special guest, very honored, is my son, Patrick, who will be joining me for a conversation about genocide, specifically talking about genocide in Burundi. And so we are going to start this with the what, where, and why. But before we even get into any of those three questions, I want to talk to you a little bit about something that I hope you were introduced to in school. I don't know, you can tell me, 'cause I didn't teach you. And that is the 10 stages of genocide. We're not going to go through all 10, but in fact, there only used to be 8, but they've actually increased it up to 10 stages of genocide. And why do you think we even classify these different stages, this evolution of genocide? Why do you think we even need to put labels on things like that?
Well, I believe that I think it's all kind of a part of genocide as well, is separating and grouping things as they are and separating. I think it just makes it easier to digest all the atrocities that happened during genocide, to really kind of pinpoint why, where, how come these type of things occur. So I believe that's why we kind of try to make it a little bit easier, make 10 separate steps to help people really understand how this can happen.
Yeah, so you use 2 magic words, 10 steps, which is a great way to think about them. And then you even said grouping, which is actually the very first stage, which is something that it's labeled classification, but that's all you're doing. You're putting people in different groups. I mean, today, for our topic, as we talk about Burundi and a little bit into Rwanda, we'll be talking about the Hutu and the Tutsi. Now, those are 2 ethnicities, not tribes. I made that mistake once. I mistakenly said to a Burundian that we were talking about the Hutu and the Tutsi tribes, and I was told, oh, no. These are not tribes, these are ethnicities. But you're still classifying people into who they are, and you're making decisions about these people based only on that. So your point about classification is absolutely critical. And then we talk about the concept of dehumanization. And essentially, when we think about dehumanization within genocide or within any kind of warfare, really, what comes to mind when you think about how people have been dehumanized in the past?
Well, I think every genocide has an example of dehumanization, and I think it's just is the catalyst to jumping off genocide and atrocity like that. I think it also helps people separate themselves as being above one another, and I think it's definitely what is like the first step to genocide occurring.
No, that's perfect. And you're right. That idea of separating yourself and making yourself seem like you're something better than is essential. If you look at the language of the Holocaust, right, and you look at Nazi German propaganda, Jews were portrayed as rats and as vermin. We heard that same language in the genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, Burundi, Bosnia, right through today, even with the Uyghurs in China. It's all the same language. And it is that idea of making yourself feel that you are superior, because let's be honest, none of this that we're talking about today is easy. But what's the difference between trying to kill a human being and trying to kill a roach?
Well, I think it's just all the propaganda that gets spread to have people on their side as a collective, to really try to separate and not, how should I say, it's not really shine a light that we are just kind of the same and from the same place.
Yeah.
And it's just easier to have that scapegoat to really just kind of make you us against them and have you not understand that we are just all the same. There is no us and them.
So there's the $1 billion word. You know, that's exactly it. That's perfectly said. And we have to also consider, I mean, with all apologies to the roach lovers out there, do you feel bad if you kill a roach?
No. And I think, yeah, especially when I believe that a roach has invaded my house, invaded my home. I think that's where I can feel no sympathy. But if I'm walking outside, if I'm walking down the street and I purposely step on a roach, then I might feel a little more like, oh, there was really no point to do that.
But if that roach is in your house and you suddenly now feel that it's wrong to be there, you can kill it, because it's a heck of a lot easier to kill a roach, kill vermin, than it is a person.
Yeah.
So that dehumanization is there because just psychologically, we're able to convince ourselves, or if we can convince ourselves, that, hey, I'm not actually killing a human being. I'm killing something less than a human being. The guilt, the stress, whatever words you want to use, is far lessened through that level of dehumanization. And of course, once we get to actually genocides being conducted, one of the things that we're going to talk about today with Burundi is actually the final stage, which is denial. Right now, governments, it's never easy for a country to come to grips with their own darkness and their own mistakes, particularly when it's as ugly as a genocide. But what do you think the biggest concern is? What's the worst aspect of a government denying that they were involved in these atrocities? What can happen?
Well, it's the old saying, like, history, you know, if you don't acknowledge history, you're doomed to repeat it. And I think denying and not, I think it's also just disrespectful to the nation of, you know, brothers, sisters, cousins, all the families that were destroyed and still live in that same nation, having to deal with knowing that the government that they trust and that should be there for them completely just wipes everything out of the way, completely just tries to sidestep any wrongdoing, no full acknowledgement. So I think that is one of the hardest parts of a nation trying to sweep everything under the rug.
Yeah, so there's that old saying that history repeats itself, and some people will disagree and say that history may not necessarily repeat itself, but it rhymes a lot, that you see a lot of similarities, and we do, because you could even go back to genocides pre-Holocaust. I mean, the term genocide grew out of the Holocaust through the work of a brilliant lawyer named Raphael Lemkin, but there were genocides before the Holocaust. In fact, Germany was involved with the first genocide of the 20th century, involving the Herero and the Nama people, which is in today the country of Namibia. Now, was that taught? Did you ever run into that?
No, we barely even got into the genocides of our own nation, of the Native Americans. I mean, we, you know, skim over it a little bit. We learn about Christopher Columbus and everything. I think as time moves on, as I got a little bit older, the truth kind of came out a little bit more, or was more accepted to teach about things of our own nation and of the atrocities that, you know, Columbus made. But if we're not even going to talk about the United States, we're not even going to, we couldn't even point out where Namibia is on the map then. They, you know.
Yeah.
So, no, things like that were not brought up at all.
And it's, see, that's devastating, because again, if you look back and you study what the Germans did in Namibia, it was in some ways a bit of a blueprint for what we saw in the Holocaust. There was forced labor, starvation, medical experiments. There were so many similarities. And the justification that was given was that those individuals were not worthy of German citizenship. So the trends of genocide just run through all of these atrocities, which is what makes working to try to prevent genocide so frustrating, because history has laid bare how these things play out. It's the exact same playbook. Almost every single time, the people may change, the language may change, the geographical position of the country and the world may change, but the similarities are so resounding. Now, you said that never came up in high school. Don't feel bad. I was in my 40s and in a good, doctoral program before it was ever brought up to me, so I understand. So I probably know the answer to this already, but what do you know about Burundi?
Burundi, I know that it's in Africa. I have a little bit more insider information from all of your like teachings and everything. But if I was to go up to anyone I know and say, "Hey, do you know where Burundi is?" I feel like they would have no clue.
But you know it's in Africa, so that's
I do
good.
know it's in Africa.
So that's good. That's the start. Yeah, and Burundi is a tiny East African nation, part of the Great Lakes region of Africa. It used to be one country with Rwanda, which is why we're going to talk about Hutu and Tutsi in both lands. Today, depending on where you look, sometimes they are, sometimes they're not, but they're very, very close, if not actually the poorest country in the world. And you are talking about a nation in which, if you go into the really rural areas of Burundi where it's all farming, less than 10% of the people have electricity. So this is a country that's largely overlooked in the world, despite its natural beauty, despite the fact that the coffee is incredibly good. This is a country that not many people know much about. And it's a nation, as small as it is, it's about the size of Maryland. It's had 2 genocides carried out, one in 1972 and one in 1993. Now, when it comes to the connection between Africa and Europe, right, generally speaking, how would you describe sort of some of the history between European colonization and colonialism and Africa?
Well, I think the Europeans went in, took everything that they could until as far as they could, and then just essentially had bigger fish to fry as time went on, completely up and left all the different African countries and nations with no blueprint or guide on how to run or be self-sufficient or any symbolism of a decent government to run. So they just kind of took natural resources, of course, took people as well, and just kind of turned their back on Africa, as they still continue to do now.
It's true. No, that's very true. And we could talk a little bit about the massive Chinese investment in Africa, unlike many Western nations, which you're absolutely correct. And we have to remember this all started back in a Berlin conference back in 1884, where the powerhouses of Europe, without exaggeration, just sort of unfurled a map of Africa and decided which parts each one would take. And I'll give you one guess as to how much African representation there was at the Berlin conference. If you're thinking 0, you're right.
Yeah.
And originally, the area that was Rwanda Urundi, which was the name originally for Rwanda and Burundi before they became independent in 1962, it was originally actually German territory. But after World War I, where we know things didn't go particularly well for Germany, they had all of their colonies taken away. That was part of the Treaty of Versailles. And so the Belgians ended up running Burundi. Now, we are certainly well aware of what the Belgians did in the Congo. And what ended up happening in Burundi is that they looked at, there's 3 ethnicities in Burundi. There's the Hutu, the Tutsi, and then the Twa. The Twa are the indigenous people. They're a very, very tiny fraction of the population. About 84, 85% of the population in Burundi was Hutu. So 14% or so are Tutsi. So a pretty clear difference. Now, if you were setting up a government, who do you think would have traditionally been in charge?
I think the people with the largest percentage,
Yeah. Exactly. It's usually how it's set up, right? That's so what it should have been the Hutu, right? If you're going purely by numbers, Hutu should have been in charge. But what ended up happening was the Belgians looked at the Tutsi and they said, well, they're a little bit taller. Their noses are a little bit thinner. Their facial structure is a little bit different. So they look more European. And so since you look more European, guess what? You get to run everything. You'll run the government, education, the military, everything will be yours. And so then in those post-colonial years, remember, Burundi becomes independent in 1962, they have elections. They actually have democratic elections. And not surprisingly, the Hutu win. They win the majority of the seats. Because if you've got 84 versus 14% of the population, you're going to win democratic elections. So the expectation was that the king would bring in a Hutu prime minister. He didn't. He brings in a Tutsi friend of his. So now the Hutu, who are the overwhelming majority, look at their government and say, well, this is completely corrupt. We have the majority of the seats, but they're still going to have all the power. So very often throughout history, what do frustrated people do?
They rise up.
They rise up. Exactly. So there's going to be a series of Hutu rebellions. Another easy question. Yeah, they're 84% of the population, but who has all the military power?
The other side.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. So it's great if you're 84% of the population and you're beginning to rise up. But if you don't have the guns, if you don't have the military control, your revolution isn't going to go well. And this is exactly what eventually triggered, because it's about 10 years in Burundi of this unsettled. You could call it a bit of a truce because the bloodshed doesn't really begin until 1972, but you had a decade of anger, which speaks to something else about genocides. Do they happen overnight?
Usually no. Usually no. Usually it's a lot of resentment and anger built up over time.
Exactly. No one's ever woken up on a Tuesday and said, today's the day we launch a genocide. It is an evolutionary process, and you're right. It's resentment and anger built up over time. And we had the exact same thing in Burundi. It was a powder keg of a country that was waiting to explode, and it did in 72. And in 1972, what transpired was something that was called a selective genocide. Now, not that you would ever lead one, but if a genocide is taking place, who do you think the primary targets are going to be? Who do you want to eliminate if you are trying to control an entire country?
Probably the people opposing my power and going against what I'm trying to rule my nation for.
Absolutely. And generally speaking, would you say men or women? Or primary target now?
Primary target would be solely men.
Yeah.
Leave the women and children out of it, and then solely focus on the men who would cause the most opposition.
So in theory, you're 1,000% right. And you are correct in the sense that men were absolutely the primary target. Women and children died as well. And there was one specific group, and it's interesting when you think about it, that was truly targeted, which were teachers and professors. Why kill the educated?
Well, because they know how, lack of a better term, silly it all kind of is, that we're all from the same nation, or they're all from the same nation, and essentially the same people. Granted, they may look slightly different from each other, but they know that this is not the way to run a nation. They know that they could be better. They know that the leadership that they have now is not the correct leadership that they should be having to finally rise up and become a nation that's worth the respect and that can actually run successfully.
Exactly. because the educated people are going to be able to see through what the government is doing. They can call out the hypocrisy. So if you silence them, then think about that impact on the next generation. I mean, because it wasn't just college professors who were killed. I mean, people going down to teaching what we would call primary school or early education, even those teachers were killed. So it was about trying to silence a group that not only could see the problems as they were happening right now, but were even the people who could go on and teach that younger generation. Now, ultimately, the death toll is somewhere between now, and we'll talk about this for a sec, somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000. Now, that's a huge difference. How do you think, or why do you think there could be a 200,000 person difference in the death toll?
Well, I believe most of it was not reported and also denied as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We're talking about mass graves that are still being discovered today. So that 300,000, and generally speaking, whenever you're studying history and you get a range of death or missing, always go higher. Mm-hmm. And so it probably is, it's safe to say that the death toll is closer to the 300,000. We're still finding bodies in Burundi. And the government completely denied it. And I want to read a quote from a really brilliant man by the name of René Lamonchon. He was one of the leading scholars on Burundi. And he was talking to actually the U.S. House of Representatives back in 1988. And this is what he said about 1972. And he said, few people care and fewer still know enough about the country to challenge public indifference about its destinies. So that's a really telling quote from a truly brilliant guy, that few people cared and fewer still even know where it is. Mm-hmm. So why do we care? It happens over there. It's their problem, not ours. But if you were to sort of bring this to a close, why should we care about what happens in a country like Burundi?
I don't think it's fair for a nation like the U.S. and also the world as well to kind of pick and choose when to care, when not to care. If it's an ally of, our nation or it's a country we've never heard about, it's still a genocide and it's still an atrocity that goes on. I think it's lack of awareness and lack of education and just speaking about certain things. I think we should always care when nations are going through times of crisis like that and thousands to millions of innocent people are being killed with no real repercussion. It's not like they went on trial for anything. It's not like to the extent that the Holocaust was.
Right.
But I think it's just a lack of awareness and lack of education.
It all starts with education. Education is what's going to drive eventual, we hope, prevention of genocide. And at least if people are knowledgeable about these events, even if it is, as you mentioned, a country that most people don't know much about, like, say, Burundi. But we also mentioned the idea of inaction. And we're going to talk about that the next time you and I are together, because we'll talk a little bit about Burundi in 1993 that actually led right into the Rwandan genocide of 1994. One of those two genocides is much more well known, but you will see that a lack of action was true with both. So looking forward to continuing this conversation, Patrick. Thank you so much for everything that you gave us today. And thank you for tuning in to this episode of That Really Happened here on HMTV. I greatly appreciate my guest, Patrick Quinlan, for sharing some insights on both the genocide in Burundi and genocide in general. Please be sure to subscribe, share, and stay connected for more engaging conversations. Until next time, take care and be well.